They say that in the frozen lands of the north, where the wind cuts like a blade and the days merge with the nights, there is a legend that echoes in the taverns and halls of brave warriors. The legend of the Red Axe. Oh, but make no mistake, this is not a bedtime story for children. This story is weighted with blood and steel, forged on the battlefields and carried by those who dared to touch it. At each mention of this artifact, a Viking's gaze hardens, and silence takes over the conversation, as if the gods themselves were listening. The Red Axe is no ordinary weapon. No, my friend, it is much more than wood and metal. Forged, according to legend, by the hands of a blacksmith who had sold his soul to a mountain giant, it carries a power that is both a gift and a curse. It is said that whoever wields it gains superhuman strength and a sharp intelligence for battle, capable of predicting the enemy's movements before they even think to act. Imagine yourself in the heat of war, surrounded by adversaries, and the axe in your hand guiding each blow with divine precision. It sounds like a dream, doesn't it? But dreams come at a price. The most curious thing, however, is that the axe doesn't choose just anyone. It is like the winds of the north, unpredictable and merciless. Only those with a strong spirit, but with a shadow of ambition in their hearts, can awaken its true power. But be careful, because, according to legend, the axe demands more than courage. It tests those who wield it, like a demanding master, and demands a toll that neither gold nor offerings can pay. After all, what would that toll be? Well, they say that the Red Axe accepts nothing less than the essence of the bearer. In the dark, smoky halls of the Viking longhouses, Igor's name was whispered like an omen. Igor the Cruel. From an early age, he displayed a fierce disposition and an unshakable will to excel among his own kind. The son of a simple farmer, he grew up amid the harsh Scandinavian winters, where even bread was harder to earn than honor. But Igor was not like the other boys in the village. While they ran through the fields or listened to the stories of their elders, he sharpened a small bone knife, aiming at tree trunks with eyes burning with ambition. It is said that by the time he was 14 winters old, he had already defeated a grown man in combat, not by strength, but by the coldness with which he studied his opponent's every move. As the years passed, Igor became more than a skilled warrior. He became a ruthless strategist, a general who carried death as his inseparable companion. His campaigns were legendary, and his cruelty terrifying. It was not uncommon to hear of entire villages being reduced to ashes as Igor marched back to his people with chariots laden with plunder and prisoners. But what made Igor truly feared was not his brutality, but his ability to inspire an almost fanatical loyalty in his men. He knew exactly how to feed the greed and bloodlust of his warriors, transforming his troops into a seemingly invincible force of destruction. To his allies, he was a living legend. To his enemies, a monster out of their worst nightmares. For all his glory and power, there was something that Igor still yearned for, something that no amount of gold, women, or victories could fulfill. He knew his strength was great, but he also knew that there was always something greater. It was on one such night of celebration, with songs blaring and mead dripping from the corners of people's mouths, that Igor first heard of the Red Axe. The tale came to him from the trembling lips of a prisoner, a frail old man who swore he had seen the weapon in a cave north of the icy mountains. From that moment on, Igor was obsessed. He knew that with the axe in his hands, his strength and intelligence would be unmatched. Igor the Cruel would not only be a feared man, but a god among mortals. Igor was not a man to act on impulse, and his search for the Red Axe would be planned with the same precision that he applied to his military campaigns. Before setting out, he summoned his best men, those who had proven their loyalty and skill in battle over the years. Among them were Asmund, the tracker who could smell danger like a wolf, Gudrik, the squire whose strength was compared to that of a bear, and Leif, a young archer whose aim was so accurate that he had once brought down a raven in flight. They gathered in a secluded hall, where Igor, with a crude map in hand, plotted the route to the icy mountains to the north. He knew that the journey would not only be long, but full of challenges that would test not only their strength, but also their resolve. The journey began at dawn, with the group leaving the village in silence, their silhouettes standing out against the mist that covered the forests. The path was treacherous from the start. The days alternated between biting cold and rain that turned the ground into sticky mud. With every step, it seemed as if nature itself was revolting against them. In a narrow gorge, they faced an attack by hungry wolves. The swords of Igor and his men glinted in the moonlight, and the blood of the animals dyed the snow red. Further on, when crossing a frozen river, the current almost swept Gudrich away, who was saved by Asmund at the last moment. These dangers, however, did not shake the group's morale. Igor led as always, with a confidence that infected his men, even though he himself felt the shadow of uncertainty growing in his heart. After weeks of marching and battling the elements, they finally reached the place described by the prisoner. A dark cave opened up in the middle of a stone wall, surrounded by twisted trees and an oppressive silence. Even the birds seemed to avoid this place. Leif was the first to break the silence, jokingly commenting that perhaps the axe had already found another owner. No one laughed. Igor stared at the cave entrance with fixed eyes, almost hypnotized by the darkness that seemed to swallow them. He knew that the greatest challenge was yet to come, but he showed no signs of hesitation. With a brief gesture, he ordered the men to prepare camp for the night. Tomorrow, they would enter the cave and discover what fate had in store for them. At dawn, Igor and his men stood before the cave entrance, torches lit and weapons drawn. The darkness within seemed to pulse, as if something alive were waiting for them. The air smelled strange, a mixture of iron and something that resembled burning wood. As they advanced, the echoes of their footsteps sounded like distant drums, increasing the tension. The walls were covered in ancient inscriptions, runes that none of them could decipher, but which emanated a sense of ancient power. The torches illuminated their path, revealing sharp stalagmites and bones scattered across the floor, like silent witnesses to failed adventures. Asmund whispered something about the gods watching, but Igor was too focused to respond. After hours of wandering through labyrinthine corridors, they arrived at a vast, imposing chamber, lit by a red light that seemed to emanate from the air itself. In the center of the room, set into a pedestal of black stone, rested the red axe. The artifact was unlike anything they had imagined. Its blade was made of a metal that looked as red as freshly spilled blood, glowing with an almost supernatural intensity. The handle was dark wood, but it pulsed with incandescent red veins, as if it were alive. Time seemed to have no effect on the weapon, but it carried an aura that suggested millennia of dark history. Leif tried to take a step forward, but an invisible force held him back. It was as if the axe was waiting for someone specific, Igor. Without hesitation, Igor advanced, his eyes fixed on the weapon. As he grasped it, something extraordinary happened. A wave of energy ran through his body, like a storm that began at the blade and spread to the tips of his fingers. He felt an intense but not painful heat invade him. It was as if the axe was speaking directly to his soul, whispering ancient secrets and awakening a power he did not know he possessed. His eyes flashed with a momentary red light, and his men, once fearsome warriors, instinctively retreated. Igor raised his axe, and the sound of his shout echoed through the cavern, carrying a force that seemed to shake the very walls. He knew, in that moment, that he was no longer the same man who had entered that cavern. The red axe had chosen its new wielder, and Igor's fate was sealed. The years following the discovery of the Red Axe were marked by unprecedented chaos and conquest. For Igor, the artifact was not just a weapon, it was an extension of his will. He seemed tireless, as if the axe had given him the strength of 10 men and the cunning of a divine strategist. Battles that had once seemed almost evenly matched now ended in swift, devastating massacres. His name became a whispered curse in the neighboring lands, and children were warned with tales of the Blood General, the man who would never hesitate to shed lives to achieve his goals. In the first year after acquiring the axe, Igor turned his forces toward the coastal territories, knowing well the strategic value of controlling access to the sea. He attacked fortified towns that had resisted Viking assaults for decades, such as Arustjord and Rinhaven. The victory at Arustjord was particularly brutal. His men destroyed the city gates in a single night, using iron-reinforced siege towers and strategies that seemed to anticipate the enemy's every move. There was no mercy. At dawn, Igor's red banner flew over the walls, and the blood of the defenders stained the sea. Rinhaven followed suit a few weeks later, cementing Igor's hold on the coast and allowing him to assemble the largest Viking fleet the world had ever seen. In his second year, his hunger for power grew even greater. Igor led his army south, crossing dense forests and treacherous mountains to reach the fertile valleys of Midren and Thelsthorpe. Accounts of these campaigns describe his frightening efficiency. He was not content with simply winning battles. He would destroy the morale of his adversaries before they even crossed swords. In Midren, he spread a rumor that the axe carried a divine curse, capable of eternal damnation of the souls of those who dared to face him. When the local army finally met Igor on the battlefield, half of the troops deserted before the first clash. In Thelsthorpe, his strategy was even more ruthless. He surrounded the city and cut off all supplies for weeks, while his troops plundered nearby villages, displaying chained prisoners as trophies to demoralize the citizens. When he finally invaded the city, Igor made sure his reputation for cruelty lived on, destroying monuments, burning temples, and transforming Thelsthorpe into a symbol of his supremacy. By his third year, Igor was no longer just a Viking general or leader. He was an emperor. His rule now extended across vast regions, from the icy north to the southern plains. He had annexed a dozen kingdoms and forged uneasy alliances with leaders who preferred to live in his shadow rather than be consumed by his wrath. Coins began to bear his face, and the Skald sagas spoke of his victories with a mixture of fascination and awe. His capital, Arustjord, which he had rebuilt after his conquest, became a symbol of his empire. The port bustled with ships, and the city was a spectacle of wealth and power, but at the same time a place where order was maintained by the steel of blades and the menacing gleam of the red axe. Igor, however, was not satisfied with all this accumulated power. His mind was always projected to the horizon, seeking more. It was then that his eyes fell upon the legendary city of Eldravia, known as the Jewel of the Seven Kingdoms. Situated in the heart of a valley protected by imposing mountains, Eldravia was a symbol of culture, wealth, and strength. Its stunning architecture, with golden domes and gleaming towers, was said to be unparalleled. More importantly, Eldravia was a city that had never been conquered, protected by legendary armies and seemingly indestructible walls. For Igor, the idea of taking Eldravia was not just a goal, it was an obsession. He saw the conquest of the Jewel of the Seven Kingdoms as the pinnacle of his glory, the fulfillment of his destiny. In the halls of his fortress in Arustjord, he began to plan. Detailed maps of Eldravia covered the tables as his commanders discussed strategy. The glow of the red axe, always at his side, seemed to grow brighter with each passing day, as if it, too, yearned for this ultimate victory. Igor knew that Eldravia would be his greatest challenge yet, but he was ready. And as his reputation for cruelty and power grew, the world held its breath, waiting for the Blood General's next move. Eldravia, the city that the bards sang of in their songs, was a glittering jewel in the heart of the known world. Located in a secluded valley, surrounded by imposing mountains and treacherous rivers, the city seemed an untouched bastion, worthy of its reputation. Its walls, made of stone that reflected the sunlight like gold, were considered impenetrable, and the entrance to Eldravia itself seemed like a well-kept secret, with narrow and difficult passages guarded by sentinels who never slept. As travelers approached, they were inevitably overcome by the grandeur of the place, as if each step took them to a new era, where life and death mingled with the sound of the river's waters and the song of the winds. The city of Eldravia was, indeed, a place of contrasts. Its architecture, unmistakable and majestic, reflected the high status of its inhabitants. The buildings were mostly made of white marble, with golden domes that gleamed in the sunlight, and windows adorned with stained glass that filtered the light in mesmerizing patterns of color, casting soft shadows over the squares and gardens. In the center stood temples dedicated to the ancient gods, whose faith and practices were passed on with religious zeal. Yet even with its radiant beauty, the city was far from being a mere showcase of wealth and splendor. Its inhabitants were known for their strength of character, ruthless discipline, and a pride that made them almost uncompromising. Eldravian society was undoubtedly distinct and structured. The Eldravians, as they were called, were a people whose history and culture were deeply rooted in honor and duty. From a young age, they were educated in the arts of combat, strategy, and diplomacy, for they believed that the balance between war and peace was the true essence of their civilization. Children were trained in combat techniques from infancy under the tutelage of experienced masters, and it was not uncommon for a young man to have already fought in his first battle by the age of 16. Women, though equally skilled in warfare, were more commonly associated with spiritual and diplomatic leadership, playing a key role in the city's political decisions. It was a delicate balance between physical strength and wisdom, which was reflected in its governing structures. The city was governed by the Council of Elders, an assembly of veteran warriors, strategists, and spiritual leaders who guided the destinies of Eldravia with a firm hand. Every important decision, from alliances with other kingdoms to defense strategy, passed through the hands of these leaders, and their advice was treated as sacred law. The council, however, was not a rigid figure. Each elder was respected for his or her wisdom, but Eldravian politics allowed for intense debates and even verbal confrontations during their meetings. Democracy, in this case, was an intellectual battlefield, where only the wisest could prevail. One of the Eldravians' greatest prides was their army, whose troops were trained from childhood to protect the kingdom and ensure that its freedom was never threatened. Although the city was naturally protected by mountains and rivers, the Eldravians believed that military strength was essential to ensuring the independence and prosperity of their culture. The army was composed of a variety of specialized units, elite archers, imposing knights, and foot warriors whose close combat skills were almost legendary. Each Eldravian soldier carried a sword forged in the city's mountain kilns, which had a nearly indestructible edge, and each blow of their swords carried with it the promise of victory. But what truly made Eldravia unique was its commitment to knowledge and the preservation of the arts. Its vast libraries, filled with ancient texts, housed the accumulated knowledge of centuries of history. It was common for sages, philosophers, and scholars from all over the world to travel to Eldravia in search of learning, and many of them were welcomed into the city's temples. Eldravia's power was not limited to their physical appearance, but also to their immense knowledge of war tactics, political strategy, and ancient magic. Many believed that this wisdom was the key to Eldravia's immortality, allowing the city to prosper for countless generations. The daily life of an Eldravian was guided by discipline and respect for tradition. They believed that by remaining faithful to the ancient gods and their warrior culture, the city would remain invulnerable to any threat. Their festivities were profound rituals that combined moments of spiritual reflection with displays of strength and courage. During the Festival of the Blood Moon, for example, all the inhabitants gathered around the great temple, where the most skilled warriors competed in symbolic combats, and the priests offered sacrifices to the gods in gratitude for their protection. It was a grand event, with dancing and music, but it was also a reminder that Eldravia would never let its guard down. The city was, in fact, a fortress, both physically and spiritually. Meanwhile, Igor, immersed in his insatiable quest for power, had already made up his mind. The glow of the red axe still illuminated his dreams, and his desire to conquer Eldravia had become an obsession. Preparing for such a feat would require more than brute force. It required a meticulous plan, involving not only his army, but also allies, spies, and even subterfuges he had yet to exploit. He knew that invading the city would be no easy task. The mountains surrounding Eldravia presented a formidable natural obstacle, and the city had the advantage of being virtually impregnable. But for Igor, nothing was impossible. With the confidence he had gained over the past 3 years, Igor began to gather his troops in a Rustjord, strengthening their ranks and choosing his best warriors for the mission. He sent spies to study patrol patterns and the weak points of Eldravia's walls. At the same time, he began to form alliances with neighboring kingdoms who, while reluctant to support an outright invasion, might be useful in destabilizing internal support for the city. The psychological warfare had already begun. As his army prepared, Igor watched the red axe with renewed intensity. He knew it would be a difficult journey, but he was more than willing to pay the price for absolute dominion. Eldravia, the jewel of the 7 kingdoms, would fall to his blade. The next great challenge was at hand, and Igor knew that with the power of the axe in his hands, victory was inevitable. The tension in the countryside around Eldravia was palpable. The air was thick with the anticipation of an imminent conflict. For weeks, Igor prepared his offensive with the precision of a master strategist. The city of Eldravia, known as the Jewel of the 7 Kingdoms, proudly resisted any attempt at conquest. Its imposing and seemingly insurmountable walls were a true fortress, and its people, proud of their heritage and strength, knew how to defend their land with fury. However, Igor, now unbeatable after the power of the red axe, was determined to take it, and the city and its defenders never imagined the storm that was about to descend upon it. Igor's preparations were meticulous. With his best men at his side, he studied the strengths and weaknesses of the walls, the least guarded paths, and the city's supply routes. He knew that a frontal attack would be a guaranteed loss, for the city was protected by layers of defenses that no one dared to challenge. But Igor, with a mind as sharp as a blade, decided to attack from within. His army marched to the mountains east of the city, where, on an ancient, forgotten trail, there was a secret entrance, an underground passage that led directly to the heart of Eldravia. Igor's men knew that the success of this endeavor would depend on absolute secrecy, and they advanced with the caution of a hunter about to corner his prey. Inside the city, preparations were no different. Eldravia knew of the approaching threat, for Igor's spies had done their job efficiently. However, the city still had an unshakable confidence in its strength, as if its walls and defenses could withstand the greatest of armies. The city's commander, Alistair, was a veteran of countless battles, and his army, composed of fierce and experienced warriors, did not fear the invasion. But Igor's trickery was behind it all. and his first move was to divert Eldravia's attention. While part of his army launched attacks on the main gates, another force, camouflaged by the darkness of the night, infiltrated through the secret entrance. The battle began at dawn, when the first rays of sunlight illuminated the vast plain surrounding the city. Igor's troops, now divided into two fronts, attacked simultaneously. As the main force of Igor's army advanced through the city gates, the warriors of Eldravia were prepared for a fierce resistance. The sounds of clashing shields, unsheathing swords, and war cries echoed through the streets, marking the beginning of a battle that would remain etched in everyone's memory. Igor's strength was unstoppable. The red axe, with its red glow, seemed to wound more than flesh. It cut through the soul of those who faced it. With each blow, the warriors of Eldravia fell, slaughtered by Igor's relentless fury. He was in his element, his ruthlessness becoming legendary as he marched through the city streets, cutting down anyone who dared stand in his way. With each street he took, fear spread among the inhabitants, and many tried to flee to the mountains, but Igor's forces were already everywhere. However, the city did not surrender without a fight. Alistair, the commander, fought bravely on the front lines, trying to rally his men and lead them in a desperate resistance. He knew the streets better than anyone, and knew that the walls of Eldravia, despite their strength, were not invincible. So he tried to adopt a strategy of attrition, retreating to the higher points of the city, where the advantage of terrain could be utilized. But Igor was no fool. He knew that the strength of his men would be most effective if the battle was fought at close quarters, where the weight of his axe and the intensity of his strikes could be used to their fullest. So, without wasting any time, he ordered his men to invade the houses, the markets, the temples, and every possible place to corner the enemy army. The streets of Eldravia were filled with fierce fighting. The clang of swords, the crack of spears, and the screams of agony were all that could be heard, mixed with the smell of blood in the air. There was no longer any distinction between the invaders and the defenders. All were immersed in the same brutal fight for survival. The walls, which had once been a symbol of strength, began to give way. Some stones began to crumble under the impact of Igor's heavy attacks, and the gates, previously impassable, began to give way to the invaders. Every meter conquered by Igor's strength was a victory that brought him more power, more confidence, and more desire to dominate. But, despite the imminent victory, the commander of Eldravia still did not give up. Meanwhile, in the heart of the city, Igor was faced with a battle that, although he was already losing, still had a symbolic component that he knew he must conquer. The citadel, where the throne of Eldravia stood. He headed there with his axe, his men following his example, advancing over the bodies of the fallen. When he reached the Great Hall, the last remnants of Eldravia's forces were waiting, with Alistair at their head, determined to face Igor, even if it was alone. The final confrontation took place in an epic setting. The room was in ruins, with torches burning halfway, and the air heavy with smoke and the smell of blood. Alistair, with his sword in hand, challenged Igor, trying to land accurate blows. But with the red axe in his hands, Igor was beyond the capabilities of any mortal man. Every blow from Alistair was blocked with ease, and every move from Igor seemed as if fate itself favored him. Finally, with a devastating movement, Igor raised his axe and delivered the fatal blow, felling Alistair, who fell to the ground with a cry of pain. The city of Eldravia was finally under his control. The streets, once thriving and full of life, were now silent, covered in bodies. Igor, with the red axe in his hands, raised it to the sky, and the red glow seemed to set the very earth ablaze. He had conquered Eldravia. His name would now be known throughout the kingdoms, and his reputation for cruelty now immortalized by the fall of the Jewel of the Seven Kingdoms, would never be forgotten. But as he looked to the horizon, Igor knew that this victory was only the beginning of something even greater. The power of the Red Axe, now in his possession, would take him even further, and the story of his empire was only just beginning. Did you like this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic sagas. The journey continues.